The Trump administration has just spent $1.5 billion in American taxpayer money in order to purchase 2 private prisons, which will be turned into ICE detention facilities. But here's the catch. These private prisons, which were sold to the federal government by private prison company CoreCivic, will continue to be privately run, but publicly funded. So privately run, publicly funded. We are going to shell out the money, but we are going to have less control and oversight of these detention facilities, which, by the way, have some pretty significant human rights abuse complaints against it, labor complaints against it. So if you happen to be one of those Americans who doesn't care about human rights abuses against human beings simply because they are undocumented, they abuse Americans too. In fact, private prisons have a long history of abusing American, inmates. So this is a big problem because the reason why the federal government did this is partly because they don't want to deal with certain oversight that would be required of them in the state of California. So let's get to the details here. Now, DHS bought the 2 Southern California prisons, the Otay Mesa Detention Center and California City Detention Center, for about $1.5 billion. But the facilities will still be operated by CoreCivic employees, meaning the company will still generate income over and above the sale price from both prisons. So what does that mean? What differentiates these private prisons from publicly funded and operated public prisons is that even though they're still publicly funded, they are run by private companies that have like a board of investors. So do you understand what that means? That means that it is a business model that seeks to profit off the detention of human beings. If you make more profit, by the way, in the form of government contracts, by imprisoning more people or detaining more people, then you're going to lobby for rules or laws, regulations that would allow for the detention of more and more people. So even though this story is under the context of immigration enforcement, this is a big problem that affects Americans across the board in in states that actually have these private prison facilities. So California requires private detention centers to undergo certain oversight, but those oversight efforts will actually be far more difficult to carry out because the federal government now owns these buildings. So the purchase could protect the detention facilities from, certain legal pursuits to ensure that they're following the law. So that, by the way, includes the fact that they could now evade, ICE could now evade state monitoring in these detention facilities. Lawsuits that accuse the facilities of carrying out abuse or human rights violations, or even labor violations, which of course would impact Americans who are working at these facilities. Additionally, federally owned buildings tend to get more favorability in court proceedings. And if you're wondering, well, okay, Anna, like it sounds like you're fear mongering. Please tell me how these facilities are abusive. Like, how are they different from publicly run and owned facilities, which are also pretty abusive? Well, these tend to be a lot worse. And because of the way that they're shielded from certain regulation, it's a big problem. So ICE facilities across the country, both privately and publicly owned, have been slammed with lawsuits over detainee mistreatment, forced labor, health code violations, and deaths in custody. And guys, the number of deaths in these facilities under the Trump administration, it's really skyrocketed, and it's really terrifying stuff. So at least 21 people have died in ICE custody this year. And that's data collected by lawyer and journalist Andrew Free. And then the number of people detained by ICE has skyrocketed from 45,000 last year to more than 63,000 as of this week. So they are detaining more and more people. And look, I mean, the federal agents who are heavily armed aren't really like roaming the streets like they were before after the Renee Good and Alex Preddy killings. They stopped doing that. But that doesn't mean that people aren't being detained. Actually, the number of people who are now in detention, in ICE detention, has increased significantly. And so altogether, ICE is actively working to insulate itself from any sort of oversight or accountability. And that's a problem. We should want oversight and accountability in these facilities. We should not be the type of country that believes individuals who have not committed any violent crime, have not done anything other than maybe overstay their visa. I don't want to live in a country that thinks those types of people need to be detained and abused and tortured. I think we should be better than that, way better than that. And if we look at a country like Israel with disgust, we shouldn't want to mirror their type of behavior. But with that in mind, these types of abuses never just impact whoever the government is fear-mongering about. These types of abuses always end up boomeranging to impact Americans negatively. And in fact, we are already seeing that. Of course, we have the Renee Good and Alex Preddy shootings, killings. That was pretty bad to begin with. But what about those who are critical of ICE agents? Well, ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility is basically a sub-agency that was specifically meant to conduct internal investigations. It's an internal watchdog group. They were supposed to, inspect detention facilities, investigate allegations of employee and contractor misconduct, process security checks for new applicants. Seems pretty important, right? Well, now under the Trump administration, it appears that they're doing something entirely different. The OPR is actually investigating American citizens who have been overly critical in their view of ICE online. So understand something, we are paying for these people's salaries. And they've declared war against Americans who are hurting their feelings. So they're exaggerating about why they're doing this. They claim, their lives are in danger. I mean, they're heavily armed federal agents and they're talking about, we're so afraid, we're being doxxed online. By the way, how many people have doxxed my freaking husband online because they don't like my commentary about Israel? Federal government couldn't care less. Totally innocent guy, hasn't even freaking said a damn thing about politics. But Laura Loomer and her jacked up face can say whatever she wants. She can dox people on a daily basis, gets away with it. But when it comes to heavily armed federal agents who might be abusing their power, Americans can't be critical of that. You're gonna literally have federal agents knocking on your door following a ridiculous investigation. So let's get to those details. So between January 2025 and March of this year, OPR investigated 131 cases of criticism against ICE. Not because they wanted to see if the criticism was valid and they should do something to improve, but because they wanted to punish the critics. So OPR called these incidents of doxing and threats directed towards ICE employees nationwide. And it is unknown whether any of these cases actually resulted in legitimate criminal charges, but the Trump administration, without a shred of evidence, claims that threats against ICE have increased 1,000%. Meanwhile, there have been multiple troubling incidents involving ICE critics. So there's a guy named David Strever who sent a harsh email to ICE. No threat, just complaining about how ICE is conducting itself. Now he's actually the former acting director. He sent the letter to the former acting director of ICE. And then 5 months later, ICE agents show up at his house. He was on vacation with his daughter, but his wife was home. And so the ICE agents decided to interrogate his wife over a harshly worded email he wrote, okay. And then when David landed back here in the United States, DHS showed up at his hotel to question him. So ICE and DHS are going the extra mile. They have been waging a crackdown on alleged threats against their personnel and doxing attempts. Federal agents have sent administrative subpoenas to email and social media platforms to find out the identities of people who have posted about ICE anonymously. And let me just pause to say something that I shouldn't even have to say, but because it's so obvious, but I'm gonna say it. if you are actually issuing a very specific threat, like you contact an ICE agent and you say, this is your address and I'm coming to kill you. Obviously, that is something that's going to be investigated, and rightfully so. But there has been no shred of evidence that this is what these investigations were about. And so they have the money to do surveillance and investigation of American citizens, and they've been getting away with it. Like the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE and Border Patrol, is using a broad web of surveillance tools purchased as its budget has ballooned under this administration. And they're doing it to monitor, apprehend, and intimidate both the people it seeks to deport and the US citizens critical of its policies in the real world and online. So if you look at this graph, you'll get a sense of just how much the ICE budget ballooned in fiscal year 2025. I mean, just look at that giant spike. And these are all funds that have been allocated through the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. Laura Moraff, who is a staff attorney over at the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, pointed out how the First Amendment is being violated here, which seemed to be an important rallying cry during the 2024 elections. But so many people who purported to care about free speech now engage in the retaliatory nature of the Trump administration when we engage in speech they don't like. Nonetheless, here's what Laura Moraff said. It takes a lot to actually convict someone for their speech, and it's only possible in very limited circumstances. People do have First Amendment rights to criticize the government and to do that online and to do that anonymously. So she's right about that. I think that the reality here is that these types of ICE-led investigations into American citizens who are critical of them, it's just meant to have a chilling effect. You get a DHS agent knocking on your door and asking you questions about a strongly worded email you sent to ICE. That might terrify you into silence, and that's what they want. So the most important thing for Americans to know is what they are protected through our Constitution to do, and don't let them chill your speech. Know your rights and don't let them silence you, because this is unacceptable. And know your rights when any law enforcement, whether it's a Fed or local law enforcement, knocks on your door. They don't have a warrant, they don't get to enter. So just something to keep in mind, guys, because I do think that this is more about a chilling effect on free speech than anything else.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.